Beginning to this now, Professor Mark Swilling is the co-director of the Centre for Sustainability Transitions at the University of Stellenbosch. Professor, good afternoon to you. This is so strange. Cabinet announces a national state of disaster, a big televised announcement on the 9th of February. It takes 19 full days for the first regulations to be published. And 1 month and 5 days after that, suddenly we end up with the national state of disaster being revoked. What do you think is going on here?
Well, if you listen carefully to the minister, the underlying assumption is progress is being made in dealing with load shedding. And so the national state of disaster is not really needed anymore. And in any case, various measures were put in place, like the Energy Action Plan that she refers to. What she doesn't refer to is that there were very serious legal challenges to the national state of disaster and the regulations by OUTA, Solidarity and others. That would have been very difficult to counter, and so the state really faced the prospect of the courts taking a sympathetic view to the applicants, and that resulting in the undoing of the national state of disaster. And that's because there is very little specification of exactly what needs to be achieved by the national state of disaster. There were many of us who called, let's have a clear-cut set of points, 6 clear points of what will specifically be achieved by using those regulations. But instead what we got is every minister could use them to achieve what they wanted to in their separate ministries. And so that broad blanket approach would have been a very, very difficult system to defend.
I mean, it was publicly known before the declaration of the national state of disaster that on the President's desk was a legal opinion saying that this would be legally irrational. They went ahead and did it anyway. It came out of an ANC Lekgotla decision at the end of January. The question then becomes, during the national state of disaster, has anything really been done to actually help the national grid? Certainly from what I can see, we've got stage 4 load shedding starting in 55 minutes. I don't see any more megawatts on the national grid at this stage.
No, there isn't any more that's been put onto the grid since then. We haven't seen the much talked about emergency action to bring gas, the car power ships story back into play. We haven't really seen much action in that regard. And there isn't any evidence of any specific measures that were taken that needed to invoke the disaster regulations. And that's basically what the minister's saying. Well, listen, we've done what we needed to do. We don't really need these regulations to do it. And then the subtext is, and therefore, why go through the trauma of having to defend them in court when we don't really fully need them. And so we have a Minister of Electricity, and his name is interestingly is on the statement. And there is an Energy Action Plan, which is a kind of replica of what the ESCOM plan was, which is now being systematically implemented. But if you look at the ESCOM projection for the rest of the year, under the column likely scenario, it's all red. And red means worst scenario, above stage 2, for the rest of the year. So there isn't a lot of evidence that the problem is actually being solved, despite the fact that this is what is being said to justify lifting the emergency regulations.
The government statement particularly talks about the appointment of Hosienso Ramakgopa as the Minister of Electricity in the presidency, and says that this is really important. And that this is what the national state of disaster sort of achieved. But you don't need a national state of disaster to have a cabinet reshuffle. There have been many in the past. I also don't know, maybe I'm being too cynical here, but I don't know, Professor, if appointing a minister achieves anything. It's what the minister does that's really important. And we still have a Minister of Energy, and we still have a Minister of Public Enterprises.
We have a Minister of Energy and a Minister of Public Enterprise, but as everybody well knows, they haven't really seen eye to eye. And so it hasn't been possible for the President to build what one could call a political settlement, a kind of consensus view across the whole of government around his plan that he announced in July last year. The different ministers still pulling in different directions. So To the extent that there's a rationale for having a third minister responsible for energy, it would be to actually have a powerful minister in the presidency who's kind of more than equal to the others to actually build that consensus. And if he interprets his mandate in that way, it actually does make sense. It doesn't quite fit the notion that he's a project manager out there to kind of fix power stations, because that's really Eskom's job. So exactly what the lines of communication between him, the board, the CEO, and the team at Eskom, especially the generation team, that seems to be a bit murky. It's very unlikely that as a minister he can issue the same kinds of instructions as a CEO.
So we have this, what do I call it, a retraction of the national state of disaster announced first by Government Communication Information System, then by the ministers who gave a briefing just a moment ago. Earlier we had the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, the first retraction of the day in terms of Eskom's exemption from parts of the Public Finance Management Act and the idea that it would no longer have to publish in its financial statements wasteful and irregular expenditure. That's been retracted, we understand, temporarily. We have the minister himself, Ramaphosa, who first seemed to say that the problems with Eskom were due to technical problems. Load shedding was due to technical problems, not corruption. Now, during his visits to power stations, he's been saying it is due to corruption. We have all of these retractions, Professor Swilling. I worry when we see a cabinet or a government that makes a decision, then retracts it, makes another decision, then retracts it. What does that tell us about the decision-making during this real national crisis?
Well, yes, it's a real national crisis, but it's happening in a context of very, very low trust. And that's why even what Treasury probably thought was a seemingly innocuous routine gesture to exempt Eskom from reporting in its financial statements a series of irregularities going years back and continuing to be a kind of stain on their record, exploded into a public furor with threats of action, legal action, and so on, because of this very, very low trust environment. So it's in that context that we're seeing flip-flops. And to answer your question, what that tells us about policy making is there isn't this broad-based political settlement and consensus view on exactly what the future is for our energy sector. At the same time, the cost of coal is going up, the cost of nuclear is going up, and there's still statements in support of coal and nuclear compared to the incredible drop in prices of renewables and battery backup, which is happening around the world, and we are just part of that. So we're in the middle of, if you like, an energy transition. And energy transitions the world over, especially over the last 500 years, have often been associated with political ructions and even revolutions. So I think we should see it in that context. We're in the middle of not just fixing a few power stations, but a really fundamental energy transition, which is going to break us away from the mineral energy complex, which has always been the basis of South Africa's political economy.
We've spoken on this program to a researcher who did a PhD on this energy transition in Germany, a country with a much more, with a lot less differences, a much more homogeneous population, a much richer country than ours. She told us how difficult it was, particularly in the coal-producing areas. There must be, from other countries, lessons that we can follow to manage this transition, even under the stress of the intense load shedding that we have now.
Yeah, there are. I mean, there definitely are. And as I said, these transitions are happening all over the place in many different types of context. But we also have a precedent in our own situation, which is the decline of the gold industry, which lost the jobs of 60,000 workers. If I was a trade union in the coal sector, I would look to that and be very, very worried and say, well, we're not going to be able to stop that. We weren't able to stop it in the past. Let's invest, thinking in an alternative. And that is what happened in Germany. The unions, business, government worked together to figure out how to have an energy transition without anybody really losing their livelihoods. It was fairly successful. The geopolitical uncertainties means that temporarily they have to bring coal back in, but at the same time they have redoubled their goals when it comes to renewables in what is called the Easter package last year. So we are seeing all over the world, in the context of the geopolitical uncertainties, redoubling of commitments to get off dependence on fossil fuels, also in light of the science. And we are just part of that mix. Unfortunately, it is not fully understood. And so we have political contestations over short-term strategic calculations which don't take into account the long-term directionality. It is possible to solve these problems, but we don't have the consensus that we need.
Professor Mark Swilling, really appreciate the time and the sober analysis. Thank you very much indeed. Professor Mark Swilling is the co-director of the Centre for Sustainability Transitions at the University of Stellenbosch. All right.